Paul Shepard here. You know, a funny thing happened to me this week. Because normally when I preach, I do all of my thinking and reflecting while I create the sermon. And then when I deliver the sermon, it's your turn to reflect. And I'm kind of done because I've already done my thinking. But this last week we talked about science and religion, and that discussion between science and religion is actually a much bigger part of my life. I've spent decades thinking about that, so it's no big surprise, I guess. But I kept thinking about the sermon after it was over. In particular about the difference and the similarity between science and religion. So I've been forced to create another little short presentation I call God is Love and 1 is not equal to 2, for reasons that I hope become obvious. So let's start though, because people are missed a lot of school with COVID-19. Let's start with a math problem, because everyone enjoys a fun math problem. Am I right? Anyway, I promise you this does have religious implications, so stick with me. So let's take a case with two variables where a equals b, which we define, and they're not equal to 0. Now if a equals b, then we could say that a times b equals a times a, because a and b are the same. That should be pretty obvious. We don't normally write things like a. We normally write it a squared, so I just want to simplify that, just for my own sanity. Now you may recall, if you have an equation that's true, you can add or subtract the same amount from both sides of the equation and it will still be true. So I want to subtract b squared from both sides of the equation, which is legit because it's the same amount. And then we now have something we can factor, which would look like this. And then you'll notice there's a common factor. On both sides we have the term a minus b, so we can cancel that out. And just to rewrite that without the cross out, we get b equals a plus b. But a equals b, you may recall, so a plus b is the same as 2b. So we have b equals 2b. And if we divide by b, which we can do because b is not 0, if we divide by b, we get 1 equals 2. Now, I'm going to guess that nobody here actually believes that, and you're not very happy with that answer. But it's likely that for many of you, you can't right off the top of your head say what's wrong with this proof. And so you might be a little uncomfortable. But if you can't understand this proof and what's wrong with it, don't blame yourself. It's because of the way we're taught to do mathematics. Let me show you. I think the way we're taught to do mathematics is that you look at two lines at a time. You look at line 1, for example, and line 2. You ignore everything else and you say, well, if 1 is true, is 2 true? Well, yes, because a squared is just a times a. And then you move on. You say, well, now that I know 2 is correct, let's look at line 3. And again, you ignore everything else. You simply look at 2 and you say, I know that 2 is correct. What about 3? And you say yes. You're just subtracting the same amount from both sides. So you move on. You know that 3 is correct now. You just have to decide if 4 is correct. So you can work this out yourself, or you can trust me if you want. But the interesting thing is, you can't solve this problem this way, because this is my favorite proof, the 1 equals 2. Because if you look at it line by line like we're doing, you actually will not see a problem. If you look at it line by line, there's no mistake. The way to identify the mistake in this so-called proof is you have to look at line 5 and the premise at the same time. Because in line 5, we're dividing by a minus b, but the premise was a equals b, so a minus b equals 0. So in fact, in line 5, we're trying to divide by 0. And you may recall from math, if you divide by 0, you get gibberish. So everything below line 5 is gibberish. But you don't recognize that going through it line by line. You have to keep the premise a equals b in mind. And here's where I think there's a religious parallel. Because many religions that believe in a God, at least, would start with a premise like God is love. And of course, if God is love, God loves us. That seems pretty obvious. You step through, and you might say, well, God loves us, but you know, I've noticed that other people are not quite as nice as we are. And then if you can accept that other people are not as nice as we are, you might accept the premise that, well, other people are kind of nasty, really. And if you accept that other people are nasty, you might accept that God loves us more than God loves other people. And if God loves us more than other people, well, maybe we're more special to God than other people are. And if we're more special to God than other people, well, maybe God thinks we deserve more than other people. Though it's okay if we steal from them, enslave them, maybe even if we kill them, these other people. To me, this is a direct parallel with the math example, because if you look at these 6 state steps, you go kind of line by line, it actually does seem kind of like a natural progression. The flaw in the argument, though, is obvious when you remember the premise, that God is love. Because I think if God is love, then God would not want us to steal from or take advantage of other people. So my big conclusion is the idea that God cares about us more than other people is just as moronic as 1 equals 2. But there's a big difference, because anyone watching this, when you saw that proof that 1 equals 2, you knew it was wrong. But the idea that some people have a special status with God is not so obvious. Just look at history. Look at all the violence in the Old Testament. Look at the Crusades. Look at the colonization of North America. Look at the ongoing colonization of Palestine. The idea that some groups are loved by God more than others is not obviously wrong when you look outside the window. But to me, it's the same problem. This is what happens if we lose sight of the fundamental principle that God is love. Ignoring God is love is like dividing by 0, because we're left with gibberish.